He paid for a cook, but what arrived at the Blackwood Ranch was a ghost in a gray dress, a woman whose silence was deeper and more profound than the canyon that carved through his land. Caleb Blackwood stood on the porch of the house that had become his stone and timber tomb, watching her descend from the stagecoach. She carried a single, worn carpet bag that seemed to hold the weight of a life he had no interest in knowing. Her name was Anna, the letter from the agency had said. Plain. Serviceable. Desperate. He had specified the last part himself, knowing desperation was a currency more reliable than coin. A desperate woman would not ask questions. She would not fill the suffocating quiet with meaningless chatter. She would cook, she would clean, and she would be as unobtrusive as a shadow, which was all he required of the living. His daughter, Lily, a miniature ghost herself with eyes as wide and haunted as his own, watched from behind the thick pane of the parlor window. Since her mother's passing 2 winters prior, the house had forgotten the sounds of joy, and Caleb had made it his mission to keep it that way. Grief was a fortress, and its walls were silence. Anna stopped at the base of the steps, her gaze lifting to meet his. Her eyes were the color of a stormy sky, holding a weariness that went beyond the dust of the trail. He saw no fight in them, no spark of defiance. He saw only a deep, settled resignation, an acceptance of whatever hardship came next. It was precisely what he had paid for. He gave a curt nod, the only welcome she would receive. "The kitchen is through there," he said, his voice a rusty hinge from disuse. "Your room is above it. The girl's name is Lily. She eats at 6. I eat when the work is done. Do not speak to me unless the house is on fire." He turned and walked back inside without waiting for a reply, the slam of the heavy oak door echoing the finality of his terms. He did not see her flinch, a barely perceptible tightening of her shoulders, as if she were accustomed to harsh decrees and the slamming of doors. He did not see her take a slow, deep breath, anchoring herself to the solid earth before ascending the steps to begin her transactional existence in the house of a man whose heart had long since turned to stone. The arrangement was made. The price was paid. He had his cook. The first thing Anna did was not unpack her meager belongings, but confront the kitchen. It was the cold, dead heart of the house, a place of soot and disuse. A fine layer of greasy dust coated every surface, and the great cast-iron stove stood like a black monument to a warmth long extinguished. Caleb's previous cooks, a string of transient women who could not bear the oppressive silence, had merely used the space, none had tried to reclaim it. Anna, however, began to work with a methodical, quiet fury. She tied her hair back with a scrap of ribbon from her bag and rolled up her sleeves, revealing forearms that were slender but wiry with strength. She scrubbed the floors until the pine boards shone with their original pale luster. She polished the copper pots until they gleamed like captive sunsets. She scoured the stove, her movements efficient and tireless, and by midday, a fire was crackling in its belly for the first time in months, a hopeful, living pulse against the profound stillness of the ranch. The smell of lye soap and lemon oil slowly began to conquer the scent of dust and sorrow. That evening, the meal was simple, a thick beef stew, rich with root vegetables she had found in the cellar, and a loaf of bread with a crust so perfect it cracked audibly when she sliced it. She set a small portion for Lily at the little table in the kitchen and a larger one for Caleb at the head of the long, empty dining room table. She did not call him to eat. She simply placed the plate and a glass of water before his chair and retreated to the shadows of her kitchen, as instructed. Caleb came in from the fields, smelling of earth and sweat and bitterness. He saw the table, the steaming plate, the glint of polished silverware. He ate without a word, the food a foreign comfort in his gut. It was not merely sustenance, it was prepared with a care that felt like an intrusion, a quiet insistence on life in a place he had consecrated to death. He could hear the soft clink of a smaller spoon against a bowl in the kitchen. Lily. He had not heard his daughter eat with such enthusiasm since Mary. He cut the thought off, a familiar, sharp pain. He pushed his chair back and left the plate on the table, retreating to his study, but he could not escape the scent of freshly baked bread that now clung to the air, a stubborn, fragrant defiance of his grief. Days bled into weeks, and Anna's quiet transformation of the Blackwood Ranch continued. She was a phantom of gentle efficiency. The yellowed lace curtains in the parlor were taken down, washed, and mended until they hung like sheets of captured sunlight. The tarnished silver candlesticks on the mantelpiece were polished to a brilliant shine, their surfaces reflecting the slow, deliberate movements of the woman who had resurrected them. She found a rhythm that worked around Caleb's brooding presence, a silent dance of domesticity. She rose before the sun, her footsteps a soft whisper on the floorboards, and the aroma of coffee and frying bacon would greet him when he emerged from his solitary darkness. She never tried to engage him, her eyes always modestly downcast when he was near, her voice never rising above a murmur when she spoke to Lily. Yet, her presence was becoming a force, a gentle but persistent pressure against the walls he had built around himself. He found himself noticing things. The way she arranged wildflowers in a jam jar on the kitchen windowsill. The soft, tuneless hum that sometimes escaped her lips when she was kneading dough, a sound so low it was more a vibration in the air than a melody. He saw the care with which she stitched a patch onto Lily's worn dress, her fingers moving with a dancer's grace. He was a man who dealt in the stark realities of cattle and land, of profit and loss, but he was not a fool. He recognized this was not the work of a person merely earning her keep. This was the work of someone building a home, an act of creation so contrary to his own life of managed decay that it both unnerved and fascinated him. He would stand in the shadows of the hallway, watching her show Lily how to press a flower between the pages of a book, and a forgotten ache would surface in his chest, a ghost of a feeling he could not name. He had paid for a cook, a pair of hands to perform a function. He had received a presence, a quiet force of nature that was slowly, inexorably, letting the light back into the darkest corners of his world, whether he wanted it to or not. He told himself it was for the girl. He told himself it meant nothing. But he began to watch her hands, and the lie grew thinner with every passing day. Lily, who had learned the language of silence from her father, became the first to breach it. She was a child starved of softness, of the gentle touch and quiet hums that had vanished with her mother. She began to orbit Anna, a small, shy satellite drawn to a newfound warmth. At first, she would only watch from the doorway, her thumb in her mouth, her eyes large and solemn. Then, she started to bring offerings. A smooth, grey stone from the creek bed. A fallen feather from a blue jay. A fistful of dandelions, which Anna accepted with the first genuine smile Lily had seen on a woman's face in 2 years. Anna would thank her with a soft murmur and place the treasures on the windowsill, a growing collection of a child's affection. One afternoon, while Anna was rolling out pie crust, dusting the board with flour, Lily stood beside her, mesmerized by the rhythmic work. The sleeve of Anna's dress had ridden up her arm as she pushed the rolling pin. Lily's small hand shot out, her finger gently touching a faded, yellowish-purple mark just above Anna's wrist. "Does it hurt?" the child asked, her voice clear and untroubled in the quiet kitchen. The question was a stone dropped into a still pond, its ripples instantly expanding. Anna froze. The rolling pin stopped. Her entire body went rigid, a statue of startled fear. She jerked her arm back, pulling the sleeve down with a swift, panicked motion, her face paling. "It's nothing, sweet girl," she whispered, her voice strained. Just a clumsy bump, but her eyes darted towards the hallway, a flicker of sheer terror in them, as if expecting a blow. Caleb stood there. He had been on his way to the stables, but the child's question had stopped him cold. He had seen Anna pull her sleeve down. He had seen the flash of a bruise, the shape of it ugly and unnatural. It was not the first time. He had caught glimpses before, a shadow on her temple half hidden by her hair, a certain stiffness in her posture as if her ribs ached, but he had dismissed them, filed them away as none of his concern. He had hired a cook, not a charity case. But seeing the raw fear in her eyes, a fear directed not at the child but at his own presence in the doorway, changed something. Lily's innocent question had stripped away his deliberate ignorance. He could no longer pretend not to see. He was her employer. He was the master of this house. And a darkness he had not invited had followed this woman through his door. The air in the house grew thick with unspoken things. The domestic rhythm Anna had established continued, but now it was underscored by a palpable tension. Caleb watched her more closely, his gaze lingering, analytical. He saw how she moved with a constant, subtle guarding of her own body, how she would startle at the sound of his heavy boots on the floorboards, a reaction too sharp and ingrained to be simple deference. The bruises he now looked for were often hidden, but the evidence of their existence was in the haunted caution of her every move. He waited for a moment when Lily was not present, when the vast, empty house could contain the conversation he knew he had to have. He found her in the larder, her back to him, counting tins of peaches. "Anna," he said. His voice was not harsh, but it was direct, and it made her jump, a tin slipping from her fingers and clattering to the floor. She spun around, her hands pressed to her chest, her breath hitched. "Mr. Blackwood," she stammered, bending to retrieve the can. He stepped forward, stopping her. "Leave it," he said, his voice low. "The mark on your arm." Lily asked about it. Her face, already pale in the dim light of the larder, seemed to drain of all remaining color. She would not meet his eyes. "I am clumsy, sir. I bruise easily." The lie was brittle, pathetic. It was a shield she had used 1,000 times before, and it was useless against the weight of his stare. "Who was he?" Caleb asked, the question blunt, stripped of all pleasantry. It was not a question of pity, but of fact. He was a man who solved problems. A sick calf, a broken fence, a threat to his land. And he was beginning to understand that this woman, this quiet, resilient woman who had brought a semblance of life back into his home, was carrying a problem he could no longer ignore. She shook her head, a silent, desperate plea for him to stop. Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "Please, sir." "It is in the past. The past has a way of following," he said, his voice softer than he intended. He saw her tremble, the fine tremor of a terrified animal. He had pushed enough. For now. He turned and left her there, surrounded by the preserved fruits of a summer she had never known, a prisoner of a history she refused to name. That night, the wind began to howl, a low, mournful cry that scraped against the house like a restless spirit. A storm was coming. The storm that broke over the plains was a thing of violent, biblical fury. Rain came down not in sheets, but as a solid wall of water, turning the dry creek bed into a raging, muddy torrent within an hour. The sky was a bruised, churning canopy of black and purple, lit by jagged slashes of lightning that made the world outside the windows flicker like a faulty magic lantern. The wind shrieked, rattling the window panes and testing the very foundations of the stone house. They were cut off, an island in a sea of violent weather. And in the midst of this elemental chaos, Lily began to burn. Her fever came on swiftly, a dry, consuming heat that left her delirious and whimpering in her small bed. Caleb's blood ran cold. He touched her forehead and felt the unnatural fire, a terrifying echo of the sickness that had stolen his wife. The same helplessness, the same icy dread, seized him. The doctor was 10 miles away, across a river that was now an impassable beast. He was trapped, alone with his ghosts and his dying child. Panic, raw and primal, threatened to shatter his stoic facade. He paced the room like a caged wolf, his hands clenched into useless fists. But then there was Anna. She entered the room, a lamp in one hand, her face a mask of serene focus. The storm outside and the storm in Caleb's heart did not seem to touch her. She was an anchor of calm in the swirling vortex of his fear. "There is feverfew in the garden," she said, her voice steady and clear. "And willow bark." "Let me try." He could only nod, stepping aside as she took control. She moved with a purpose he had never seen in her before, a quiet authority born of necessity. She sent him to fetch cool water, and she stripped Lily of her sweat-soaked nightgown, sponging the child's fiery skin with a gentle, practiced hand. She brewed a bitter tea from the herbs she had gathered before the worst of the rain, coaxing the child to sip the liquid. She sat by the bed for hours, murmuring soft, soothing words, her presence a constant, reassuring weight in the room. Caleb watched from the doorway, a useless giant in his own home. He saw a strength in her he had never imagined, a fierce, protective competence that dwarfed his own panicked despair. In the crucible of the storm and the sickness, their roles were reversed. He was the one who was broken and afraid, and she, the woman with the haunted eyes and bruised arms, was the one holding them all together. The night wore on, a long, dark passage measured in the rasp of Lily's breathing and the relentless drumming of rain against the roof. The lamp cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, turning the small bedroom into an intimate, isolated world. Anna never left the child's side, her focus absolute. Caleb finally moved from the doorway and took a seat in a wooden chair in the corner, his shotgun resting across his lap, though he knew the only enemy in the house was the fever. The silence between them was different now. It was not the cold, empty silence of before, but a shared, anxious vigil. Sometime after midnight, with Lily's breathing having eased into a slightly less troubled rhythm, Caleb spoke, his voice a low rumble that barely rose above the storm. "My wife." "Mary," he began, the name a shard of glass in his throat. "It started like this. A fever. The doctor said it was her lungs. There was nothing to be done. I just watched her fade." He had not spoken of this to another living soul. The words were stones he had carried in his gut for 2 years, and now he was laying them at the feet of this near stranger. Anna turned her head, her eyes luminous in the lamplight. She saw not the formidable rancher, the wealthy landowner, but a man hollowed out by grief. Her own defenses, so carefully maintained, began to crumble in the face of his raw vulnerability. "My husband, he?" She started, her voice barely a whisper. "He was not a good man. He had a temper, especially when he drank." He called them accidents. She unconsciously rubbed the wrist that Lily had touched, her gaze distant, lost in a terrible memory. The last accident, it was his. He fell from a horse, drunk. When he was gone, his brother said I owed him. Said a wife's debt passed on. She took a shaky breath. "I packed my bag that night and I ran. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't be owned anymore." There, in the heart of the storm, with a sick child sleeping between them, they exchanged the truths of their broken lives. The transaction was forgotten. He was no longer just her employer, and she was no longer just his cook. They were two survivors, adrift in the same darkness, and for the first time, they were not alone in it. A profound and unspoken connection was forged in that room, a bond sealed by shared pain and the flickering light of a single lamp against the raging night. By morning, the storm had broken, leaving a world washed clean and glistening under a pale, watery sun. Lily's fever had broken with it. She was weak and pale, but her eyes were clear, and she was sleeping a deep, healing sleep. The air in the house felt different, lighter. The oppressive weight of unspoken grief had lifted, replaced by a fragile, tentative peace. A few days later, life had settled into a new, gentler rhythm. The silence was comfortable now, punctuated by Lily's returning laughter and the easy, domestic sounds of the kitchen. Caleb found himself making excuses to be in the house, to watch Anna as she worked, to share a quiet cup of coffee with her at the kitchen table before the sun was fully up. One afternoon, Anna took the wagon into the small town of Redemption for supplies. Caleb, telling himself it was simply to check on a shipment at the freight office, rode in a short while after her. As he tied his horse to the hitching post, he heard a commotion from inside the mercantile. A man's voice, loud and bullying, and a woman's, pleading and frightened. He recognized Anna's voice immediately. He pushed through the swinging doors just in time to see a burly, unshaven man grab Anna's arm, the same arm he knew she favored. "You're coming with me," the man snarled, his face flushed with anger and cheap whiskey. "You owe me." "Jacob's debts are my debts now," Anna struggled, her face a mask of pure terror. "I owe you nothing, Thomas." "Let me go." The storekeeper, a timid man named Abernathy, wrung his hands, unwilling to intervene. The few other customers simply stared, not wanting to get involved. Caleb moved without thinking. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, his presence sucking the air from the space. He did not draw his gun. He did not raise his voice. He simply placed a large, calloused hand on the man's shoulder. Thomas spun around, ready for a fight, but froze when he saw the cold, unyielding fury in Caleb Blackwood's eyes. Caleb was the most powerful man in the territory, his land, his cattle, and his reputation were legendary. "Take your hand off her," Caleb said, his voice a low, deadly calm that was more frightening than any shout. Thomas hesitated, his grip faltering. This is family business, he spat. She is under my protection, Caleb stated, his voice ringing with absolute authority. He tightened his grip on Thomas's shoulder, a silent promise of immense pain. She is part of my household now. You will leave this town and you will not return. If I ever see your face again, you will be buried on a piece of land that no one will ever find. The public declaration hung in the air, stunning the onlookers. He was not just defending his cook. He was claiming her. In front of the entire town, Caleb Blackwood was drawing a line in the sand. Thomas, sweating under the weight of that gaze, released Anna's arm and backed away, stumbling out of the store like a beaten dog. Anna stared at Caleb, her eyes wide with disbelief and a dawning, overwhelming gratitude. He had stood for her. He had shielded her. He had, in that one single moment, given her back a safety she thought she had lost forever. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, but the space between them was charged with the aftermath of the confrontation. Anna sat straight on the wagon seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, stealing glances at the stern, impassive profile of the man riding beside her. He had not spoken a word since leaving the mercantile, his focus seemingly on the road ahead, but she could feel the protective energy still radiating from him. When they arrived, he helped her down from the wagon, his hand lingering on her elbow a moment longer than necessary. The touch was firm, grounding. It was a promise. That evening, the new dynamic in the house was undeniable. The last vestiges of the employer-employee relationship had been burned away in the fire of Caleb's public declaration. When Anna served dinner, Caleb gestured to the chair opposite him at the massive dining room table. "Sit," he said. It was not an order, but an invitation. She hesitated, then complied. Lily, who had been eating her meals in the kitchen, was brought in to sit between them. For the first time, they ate as a family, the vast, polished table feeling less like a barrier and more like a shared space. The next day, Caleb returned from another trip to town and placed a package wrapped in brown paper on the kitchen table. "For you," he said gruffly, before turning to leave as if embarrassed by the gesture. Inside, Anna found a bolt of deep blue calico cloth, dotted with tiny yellow flowers. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever owned. Her throat tightened with emotion. It was not just a gift, it was an acknowledgement. It was a way of saying he saw her, not as a functionary, but as a woman. Over the next few days, she spent her evenings by the firelight, sewing. She made a new dress for Lily first, the bright fabric a stark contrast to the girl's previously drab attire. Then, with the remaining cloth, she carefully stitched a dress for herself. When she wore it for the first time, its simple grace transformed her. The dark, shapeless gray of her past was replaced by the hopeful blue of a clear sky. Caleb saw her standing by the window, the afternoon sun catching the yellow flowers in the pattern, and he felt a stirring in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. It was the feeling of a heart, long frozen, beginning to thaw. The seasons turned. The harsh memory of winter faded, giving way to the tender green of a prairie spring. Anna's small kitchen garden, once a hopeful patch of turned earth, was now thriving with herbs and vegetables. The house, once a monument to grief, was now filled with the scent of baking and the sound of Lily's unrestrained laughter. The peace they had found was not a sudden, dramatic revelation, but a slow, quiet dawn, earned through shared hardship and unspoken understanding. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of lavender and rose, Caleb found Anna in the garden, gently tending her tomato plants. He stood beside her for a long moment, watching the familiar, graceful movements of her hands as she tied a drooping vine to a stake. The silence between them was no longer a void but a comfortable, shared language. "The soil is good here," he said finally, his voice soft. "Anything will grow, if you give it a chance." She looked up at him, her face illuminated by the dying light. She understood he was not just talking about the garden. He was talking about them. He was talking about the fragile, tentative thing that had taken root in the barren soil of their lives. He reached out, his large, calloused hand hesitating for a moment before it gently cupped her cheek. His thumb stroked her skin, a touch that was both a question and a comfort. "I was dead for a long time, Anna," he confessed, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. This house was a grave. You brought it back to life. You brought me back. He looked over at the house, where a warm, golden light now spilled from the windows, and at Lily, who was chasing fireflies on the lawn. A child needs a mother, he said, turning his gaze back to her. And a man needs a reason. He wasn't a poet. He didn't have the words for the depth of his feelings, for the profound gratitude and burgeoning love he felt for this resilient woman. So he offered her the only thing he could, a future. My name, he said simply. I want you to have it. Not as a payment. Not as protection. But as a beginning. Tears welled in Anna's eyes, but these were not the tears of fear or sorrow she had known for so long. They were tears of overwhelming joy, of a peace she had never dared to dream of. He held out his hand, palm up. A silent offering. A solemn promise. Without hesitation, she placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, strong and sure. Together, they stood in the garden they had nurtured, watching the last light fade, a new family forged not in a church or by a contract, but in the crucible of shared pain and the quiet triumph of a love that had refused to die. Some stories are not written in ink, but are etched into the landscape by the quiet courage of broken people. The tale of Caleb and Anna reminds us that even the most frozen heart can be thawed by persistent warmth, and that the deepest wounds can be healed by a love that asks for nothing but a chance to grow. Their journey teaches us that true strength isn't found in walls built to keep the world out, but in the vulnerability it takes to let someone in. If this story of redemption and renewal touched your heart, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more inspirational stories that celebrate the enduring power of the human spirit. Click the notification bell so you never miss a moment of hope.